Hi, this is Ted at Valley the Dolly. I wanted to thank all of you who have taken the time to like and subscribe to the videos. It's really helped the algorithm a lot. And if you haven't had a chance to subscribe, please feel free to hit that button and you'll be notified when the next video comes up. So back we go to the rental market in Portugal and Lisbon. First, I want to discuss the Mais Habitual and how this has affected the rental market. Why is this important? Because this was one of the final measures that was passed by the previous Prime Minister Costa before his government was replaced by Prime Minister Montenegro's in the March 2024 election. This law that was passed affected rentals in a number of ways. And what we're finding is that there's a huge increase in the number of units that are available now for rent. If you go to some place like Bragança in the northeast section of Portugal, which is quite a bit of ways from the ocean, inventories there are up 191% year on year. If you go to Porto, inventories on the market are now up 129% for rentals. If you look at Lisbon, inventory there is up 102% year on year. So there are a lot more units out there to rent than there were previously. Just going back as little as a year ago, they've doubled now. That may be one of the reasons why the current government is so eager to repeal some of those measures that were included in the Mais Habitual. This is a quote from Ruben Marques at Idealista and it was included in the Portuguese news article. Some initiatives implemented by the previous government in the housing sector seem to be having an impact on the rental market in Portugal, with a significant increase in the supply of housing for rent. The first thing we're going to discuss is this concept of forced rentals. So in this agreement that passed last year in the Mais Habitual, it allowed the government to force the rental of some of the 700,000 unoccupied homes and apartments across the country. Now you got to remember that Portugal has a population of about 10 million. That's about one unoccupied home for every 13 people in the country. So this means that if the unit is habitable as it is right now without a lot of repair, then those units are required to be put up on the market for rent. Maybe that's partly why we're seeing a doubling of the inventory of rent in Lisbon and a lot of other locations. The second is if the unit is not up to code and needs renovations to make it habitable, then the government or the landlord will need to complete those renovations. And if the government does it, they're going to reduce the rent paid to the landlord to reimburse for the cost of these renovations. So this is a really dramatic thing to implement, and for a landlord, it's pretty traumatic to know that your unoccupied unit, which you may not have been intending to rent because it's just not habitable, and you're not exactly sure or you don't want to face the renovations that would go into this, well, the government's basically saying we need to renovate those units and get them back out on the market. Part of this measure that went into effect last year is a rent freeze, and the rent freeze was set at 2% a year. Why 2% a year? It was believed that inflation would come down to 2% in 2024 and would remain somewhere around there, so they thought a 2% cost of living increase made sense. But under pressure from the landlords, they were allowed at the end of this last year into 2024 to increase the rent that was being charged to tenants by 6.94%, or basically 7%. So it won't be a surprise, would it, if we look at the final figures for 2023 and you see an increase in rent. Why? Because tenants were being charged an increase in rent. Not only this, but this 6.94% is the largest increase in rent that's been allowed since 1994. So that's 30 years since we've seen an increase this large allowed by the government. The third thing we're seeing here is that short-term accommodations were really affected by this proposal being enacted. Which account for a huge portion of income for people. That there was a study that was completed by Nova SBE, and this was at the request of the Association of Local Accommodations in Portugal, or ALEP. And the ALEP had requested this study because they wanted to understand how this would affect landlords or people who had short-term rental units and were renting them out. So they wanted to provide some statistics to the public so they understood how potentially traumatic this could be for people who were working in this market. So the first was that they wanted to note that only 13% of people who have short-term rentals would be willing to convert those into long-term rentals. Now 13% still is nothing to sneeze at if you're talking about over 100,000 units in Portugal that are currently short-term rentals, if that's the case. The second thing that they really wanted to point out and hit home with is that 73% of the people who own these units are older, and they questioned whether or not, if they were forced back into the job market, or if they were looking to supplement the income they lost from renting out units as Airbnbs, would they be able to recover that income and continue? They also wanted to note that 40% of tourism overnight stays, I think this was just a few years ago when they last found the statistic, they reported that 40% of overnight stays were accommodated by Airbnbs or local short-term rentals. And so that's a big sector of people who are coming to Portugal who are utilizing that, especially when you think that only 3 out of 4 actually have a license for a short-term rental. So if you're coming to Portugal or Lisbon or Porto, you may find that the unit that you've rented as a short-term rental doesn't even have a license. And the percentage chance of that would be about 25%, right? Also, they pointed out that 46% of the people who have these short-term rentals make less than $1,000 a month from the rental. That kind of shocked me. If you look at it and you think people are making 100 euros a night from renting out their unit, if they're only making less than $1,000 a month, that means that unit is probably vacant 2/3 of the month. So it's understandable, really, that with all of these figures this report threw out, why people who have short-term rentals may not be willing to give up that income so easily when it came time to really look at moving their unit to a long-term rental from a short-term rental. The fourth thing I wanted to discuss here was the housing construction issue. This wasn't something that I really felt was really addressed as much by the Mais Habitual, but what you're finding is that before the economic collapse that happened in the middle of the 2010s, this is where Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, you find that before that, in Portugal, they were constructing 10,000 residential buildings, and those were the number that were being completed every year. If you fast forward after the financial crisis, it has not really improved over 3,000 buildings being completed every year after that. So you're seeing less than 1/3 of the construction that was being done prior to that. And just like in the United States and so many other countries, so much of this construction is being focused on the high end. So you see a lot less construction, and what is being done is being focused on the high end because there's a higher profit margin then. When really what needs to be addressed is the median and the low income housing sectors, because those are the ones that are really falling short on housing. Now, this is something I wanted to note. This is another comment by Ruben Marquez. He notes that restrictions on local accommodations, the end of the non-habitual residency regime, and the reduction in income taxes may have contributed to a reinforcement of the availability of properties on the market. And what he's also saying here, and what I have found other experts saying, is let's look at the next 6 months, because if the government of Montenegro is able to repeal some of these things that were implemented in the Mais Habitual, will we continue to see the inventories go up the way that we have? Or will we see inventories dwindle just as the regulations, the articles in Mais Habitual dwindle? Now, if you look at what the Institute of Statistics published for the fourth quarter 2023, you're going to see an increase of 11.6% in rent year over year. I also think it's really important to remind everybody that the renters were hit also with almost a 7% increase at the end of the year, beginning of this year, because of mais habitual and the allowance of this large increase. Because it's quite possible that with this huge increase in inventories, you're not going to see landlords continue to charge new renters huge increases in rent. You're going to see those rents begin to really stagnate, because renters are going to have a choice if you have 100% more inventory on the market in Lisbon alone. There was a note that Idealista had found that there was still 34 people who were interested in every unit that came up for rent. But I question the level of interest, because it's quite possible people are browsing or searching, possibly saving that unit, but never pursuing that unit. I know that when I've gone out to rent, you'll go through, you'll hit a whole bunch of likes, you'll save those, and then you'll go combing through those, see what's actually available, which one truly meets your need, and then of that 30, you may pick out just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 to go see. It's also really important to note that Lisbon, which is one of the most expensive rental markets in Portugal, didn't see the largest increase in rent. They were right at the average of 11.6. They and about half the other cities or districts were in the lower end. The ones slightly higher than that, even including Porto, are smaller markets than what you're seeing in Lisbon. So Lisbon is no longer really leading the way with rental increases or demand. And I think that's partly just because we're seeing fatigue in what people are willing to pay for rental properties in Lisbon proper. So this is Ted at Valley of the Dolly. Please hit the like and subscribe button. And I would really like to hear if you are renting a unit in Portugal. Are you finding that inventory is making your search easier? And I did this a couple months ago, and I think a number of people have said that they found it easier to rent an apartment. But I'm also wondering if you're finding that you're not paying as much as you anticipated you would pay. This is Ted at Valley of Dolly. I look forward to talking with you again soon. Thank you. Bye now.